that the buildup of energy from life-threatening events is expelled out of animals through a physical response. It's not given the opportunity to live inside their bodies. I thought that this was really interesting. And as a result, I started to think a lot more about somatic experiencing, which is what Peter A. Levine came up with. Most animals obviously exist in their bodies very differently from the way that we do. They're very differently situated in place and time, and they're very firmly situated in place and time in a way very different from us. So I started to wonder what it meant to dispel trauma without this barrier. Is this trauma exiting the body and entering the environment around the animal? So my most recent works include the release of a poem anthology called Ottawar, which at first glance would appear to be about trauma, but it's actually more about the spaces between trauma, like those spaces that happen before and after, and where those experiences live in us. So that's where a lot of this has come from, especially considering how alienating trauma is, and also simultaneously how alienated we feel from nature. And as a result, we have difficulty properly experiencing urgent events that are occurring in our natural world. So what is somatic poetry? How does it relate to eco-grief? Once going back to Peter A. Levine, he wrote that somatic experiencing, which was a form of therapy he came up with to treat trauma, was sessions that involve the introduction of small amounts of traumatic material and the observation of a client's physical response to that material, such as shallow breathing or a shift in posture. Somatic therapy and somatic experiencing are not a science. There's no rigor or theory or peer review. It feels true-ish, and that is considered sufficient to generate positive affect. The reinterpretation of this by poet C.A. Conrad into somatic poetry, they describe their process as a poetry which investigates the seemingly infinite space between body and spirit by using nearly any possible thing around or of the body to channel the body out and or in towards the spirit with deliberate and sustained connection and concentration. So they follow a very particular method of their making. They start by creating a ritual. They ask us to engage with things with our bodies by looking at things in a way that we don't get to see them from a different angle. They encourage observation through lenses that are not normally available to us. They ask us to change our posture when we look at things, to change the angle of our gaze, our own physical shape. And they also say something that's kind of interesting, which is that there's nowhere where poetry is not possible. And they're, of course, speaking of where we are situated when we make it. But I interpret this also as the place in which the poem lives beyond where it is expressed. So the poem does not even need to be uttered to exist. It does not require a mouth. It is possible elsewhere. It is a phenomenon. And it is spontaneously generated in our bodies and can be expelled to or out into the world, even in silence. Then C.A. Conrad says that we require notes around this viewing that allows us to create filters. And they talk a lot about how this is intended to bring us to rebuke words and their meaning rather than running towards them. We're not necessarily filtering for wrongness. We're more filtering for our own censorship of wrongness. And finally, they shape the work, which is basically just building it out of what remains. So today, the thing that we're engaging through somatic experiencing is media, data, information relating to ecological devastation and its affect, which is something that we're generally desensitized to, and rarely do images elicit more than like a bit of anxiety, perhaps. So by removing this barrier between us and these events, we can determine where eco-grief is manifesting in our own bodies and experience ecological devastation somatically. So I will be reading from my notes, which function as filters in C.A. Conrad's sort of framing. And the goal is, there's no purpose to this. I really want to make that clear. The goal is not to inspire greater investment in the cause of climate change, or to cause anyone to engage in revolutionary action. We're not trying to control nature or save it in this exercise. We're just acknowledging our own existence within it and recognizing its affect. By not demanding purpose, we also do not demand impact. We don't demand change. We don't require anything from us or our environment. And this lack of demand and predetermination is, I feel, closer to our natural world than any sort of attempt to control what the end result is. So I went on to look at a lot of different forms of environmental damage. And there are some in particular that I chose just because of their tactility and how observable their urgency is. And the goal was not really to choose something that would incite fear automatically, but just urgencies that are commonplace, but still difficult for us as just like fragile human beings to withstand. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this. Please bear with me. Most of us are already well aware that we're facing worse and worse forest fires every year. Like last year, for example, a single fire in Yakima County burned 107,000 acres, which is just one of about 60,000 wildfires that happened last year. So I believe all of the wildfires in the United States totaled 7.1 million acres of destruction. Unfortunately for us, these are just numbers. We understand what they amount to, but they also mean very little to us. 7 million people is a medium to large city at best. $7 million is nice, but many people spend that on a single boat or property. A $7 million salary is enormous, but the longer it takes you to accrue, the less impressive it becomes. 7 million animals is a small number. 7 million ants is to be expected. So it really doesn't really mean much to us when we just know that it's a lot. With the age of unending forest fires, we have new forms of like devastation to have to face, but we don't really have a lot of anecdotes or closeness to these dangers. We already know that fire twisters exist, but fire tornadoes as a concept seem almost comical, as if they were a plot to a B movie. Even viewing footage of this phenomenon doesn't really seem real. Joyce, if you could play. So this is a fire tornado forming. And it doesn't really feel necessarily real. It's difficult to find any place in my body when I view this that feels deeply about what I'm seeing. If anything, it looks beautiful. That stretching column, like pulling it up towards the sky, it looks architectural. It doesn't really feel like it's about power, even though it's a necessarily powerful thing. So this is a clip of a flash flood that I found. Viewing images like this also doesn't generate that much affect. This is pretty apparent when there are no people present in the image. The rushing of water is at a high level, like the trees that are being brushed away by the water. None of that necessarily feels unnatural or alarming. If anything, at worst, it seems unusual. We have no relationship to these sites that would necessitate a specific order of things that is being disturbed by what we're seeing. For all we could feel or know, these trees are being watered. The animals whose homes are being washed away could be refreshed. We could fantasize that this is a clearing of the weak to make way for the strong. Viewing submerged landscapes doesn't immediately bring destruction to mind. The landscape simply gives way to another landscape. Water is also a substance that gives great way to its own beauty. It's difficult to view it as menacing or danger, even when it's at its most violent. Flooding in general, viewing it without people there feels almost like a passive event. Its seeming slowness makes it feel as if it's actually quite harmless. It's almost an assault of indolence. Unlike most forms of climate disaster, we're pretty familiar with pollution. This is the 2010 BP oil spill. We're used to seeing very, sort of sexy, viable images of things like animals covered in oil or dolphins with rings around their snouts and things like that. But in viewing this feels almost benign. If a person was to show this image to us and claim, with like very real sounding scientific rhetoric that this was a phenomena caused by algae or an amalgamation of micro seaweed or like any sort of pseudo plausible natural explanation, it wouldn't seem that far-fetched. I don't feel poisoned when I look at this image. So much of the dulling of affect of these images is that they're so impersonal and oddly beautiful. We don't really spend enough time in the ocean for this to cause alarm. The few who are empowered do and are as unaffected as we are. Ecological empathy doesn't really seem to be about proximity, ownership, or recognition. It's more an active engagement of straining against the temptation to lapse into passiveness and allow the tension of that engagement to ease. So for a lot of us, it's only when we relate these things to physical trauma that we can actually begin to feel this affect. Once a human being is inside the image, the precarity begins to dawn on us. Like when we say that something is enormous, we normally need to see a small human being in the image in order to understand the scale of the enormity, right? But that's also a limitation. Like once the presence of a human being is established, our ability to feel disaster is compromised by our own bias. The proximity of a culture to our own, our recognition of a landscape, of a sort of building, a species of tree, all impact our capacity to experience grief fully and absorbing disasters. I'm sure many people can attest to having something of a different reaction to the floods in BC than they do to constantly receiving a barrage of images of flooding in China and India over the course of several years, right? Mostly our horror mounts only when those disasters are close to home because they feel more impossible, but a lot more real as a result. And these images of the flooding of Henan province in China, they're hard-hitting to extent, but we're mostly bearing witness. Like these are news images, right? There is a certain sense of devastation that you wouldn't normally get if you're just looking at a flood without human beings involved. We kind of see how fragile we are in the face of a disaster like this. And we also see how fragile the assistance that people receive is. However, witnessing them as if they were a news story or documentation doesn't necessarily give way to empathy quite so much as sympathy. For many of us, including me, you might not be able to imagine yourself there. If anything, you feel a certain tension, but it's not quite the same as being properly affected by what it is that you're experiencing and doing. In thinking about pollution, I started to explore pollution that actually impacts human bodies. So I was looking at radiation sickness. We know that there's a lot of nuclear power being used throughout the world and that these are all very fragile constructions that can be decimated by nature at a moment's notice. And we're not really prepared for the reality of becoming in contact with the radiated material because it's not a part of our general lives. Seeing another person suffer in ways that are so unrecognizable obviously makes us fearful, obviously causes a certain degree of affect. We feel for the person even as the extent of their injuries kind of isolates us from them. But it's something that very much belongs to us. Nuclear power is something that we all benefit from and use in certain ways. And we know also that it's something that we're socially capable of using as a weapon on each other. So it's hard not to be disturbed by that understanding, but this is still a spectacle of suffering in a way. Like we have to ask if we have the ability to empathize profoundly with this degree of pain, especially when it makes a person's humanness feel unrecognizable to us. Is another form of violence that is both environmental and wrought by human beings. And continuing to look at the use of fire as violence and as an environmental impact, I found this footage of a political burning of a man who was in support of the Venezuelan president. We understand that this is something that is visited upon him by people in his environment, but because it is a political act created by environmental pressures, it's not necessarily something that's just happening between two people. And as a result, it feels more like this is also in its own way sort of a natural disaster. And this is kind of like, in my opinion, the beginning of the journey inward that C.A. Conrad is making reference to, where the barrier kind of becomes blurred between what is a man-made disaster and what isn't. Trauma in this instance manifests very similarly. The political turmoil surrounding the event is its own storm, and it's not out of nowhere. Even the causes for environmental disasters are human-made, just as this disaster and this trauma is human-made. So we can sort of begin to recognize our own handprint. The next event that I looked at was the Miami Tower collapse. Beyond how neurotic I am as a person, I think there are some very real reasons that I was somewhat obsessed with this and constantly reading about it. It was a traumatic event that captured, you know, everyone's attention overnight and then disappeared just as fast. And we already have this habit of building all of these things as quickly as possible in order to hold things that don't really have any meaning. We have this very particular relationship with structures, right? And building collapses are expected to be a continuous problem over the next few years because they are highly impacted by climate change, rising sea level, exposure to salt water, and things like that. Initially, this was said to have been a result of a leak in a pool of the building. And it was something that people who lived there had been advised of, and they had spent months arguing over whether or not to repair it. And over time, scientists came forward and started to point fingers at rising sea levels and exposure to salt water as also the reason that this building collapsed. Now, it's interesting because it's a capitalist disaster in many ways, but that also very much makes it a climate disaster. And a lot of vulnerable cities that did not have such wealthy victims have fallen prey to this. It's actually becoming more and more common. So we're aware when we see this of how personal it almost becomes because of the very human story of why it occurred, and a very strong awareness of the tactility of these deaths. We know that these people were crushed, and we know that they were people that were saved. We have information, quotes, sound bites from people who experienced this disaster and who are able to explain to us what it felt like to be caught up in it. There were reports of a woman's voice crying for help from a section of the crash that could not be reached, and her voice eventually went silent and they never found her. It was almost impossible for them to recover a great deal of the people who were in this disaster. And so it's impossible not to think about what it must have been like to die in this particular way. And in an odd way, you kind of do begin to sort of feel it in your body if you think just a little too deeply about what this experience was and how this tragedy impacted people physically and emotionally. Going back to water in the next slide, I started to do research on waterboarding as well, which is a form of torture wrought on human bodies by other human beings. This causes quite a bit more affect than simply viewing a benign water-related disaster, right? And oddly, we have more potential to be complicit in what it is that we're witnessing. We don't feel complicit when we see a flood that happens as a result of poor building or raising of trees for construction, but we can feel more complicit when we view a form of torture that is being brought forward by our government or not being stopped by our own government that could be happening in our country or happening to a country that we don't pay close enough attention to. And oddly, this too, in its own way, is a flood. The body is a landscape. It has its microflora. It has small ecologies. It has its own world. And it's also a form of pollution in the sense that this person being deprived of air is choking on their own carbon dioxide. I can't help but look at images like this and wonder if we can be removed from a fear of death and look at it with just the instinctive need to live, and then of like the neurosis. Like, is this necessarily a closeness to death, or is it more a fight between states of being? And I often wonder, like, what is it that we feel when we look at this? For me, I definitely notice an impact in my own breathing when I think too deeply about what it is to be treated this way by another person. Just to advise you before we go to the next slide that this last image is probably one of the most disturbing here. So if you're not quite ready to see somebody harm themselves quite violently, just be prepared. For the final thing that I looked at was self-immolation. This is ultimately an act of protest, and it's meant to be an act that somebody's carrying out on themselves, but it actually is an environmental act. It's visited upon the body under conditions where nothing else is possible. It's impossible. You have to imagine that for this person, it's impossible for them not to set themselves on fire. This is an image of a Tibetan monk in protest in China who set themselves on fire. We can't know what this person is experiencing, of course. We live in the West and we are highly privileged, but we can understand in viewing this that there's something to be said for this form of self-destruction. If it's meant to echo external conditions on one's physical body, we can understand that we're not in control. And there's a sense of recognition of a lack of control when you're under such immense power that you have little left to do but immolate. There's almost a relief in recognizing that a person has put action to trauma that is going unspoken. And in that way, it feels somewhat familiar. If we finally go back to this last image in the final slide, in viewing this flood, for me, after going through those images, it feels different. It carries new meaning. It's in us as much as it is real. Like the flood is the suffocation, it is the grief, it is the breaking. It's no longer a disaster, but sort of a state of being that we share. It feels different and familiar. And there's something sort of peaceful about seeing our own death in this event. This is sort of the journey that I've taken in recognizing how my somatic experience fits into eco-grief, where in realizing that what's happening in the natural world is also happening physically to us in microcosmic ways. So I'm going to proceed by reading some poems regarding eco-grief and relating to eco-grief from the book that I recently published, Auto War, and also ending with a poem that will be doing exactly what C.A. Conrad said, which is to shape something out of what's left of these notes. The first poem is called Acid Field. Acid Field. Bones jutting up jagged, planted in this garden. Will we too be a garden on the ocean floor? An ocean so acidic, fast roaring, the salt cheering everything in it to bone. Bones for us to be too tomorrow, or something new where bones used to be. Caught breath, lost boasts, portraits, forgotten words now imprinted on relics, locked up somewhere in abandoned houses, abandoned cities, empty strongholds, fortresses. A sharp planet, all sulfur, burns everything in it, all of it a pending pre-excavation. Our little lived lives and forever copies for them to dust off and upload later, argue over who we were, bloodthirst stirring. Note we are fluent in lies, accused with citrine jewels, congregating crushed small fish together, speaking only to ourselves and starving at length, saying, I will feed on the gray gaze of your hunger. stretching to dry ourselves in the sun, slathered in thin atmosphere. We'll die anyway, the in-between doesn't matter. Our faces will be still, our eyes unrippling, frosted glass stereograms radiating wondrous rows when we arrange our powdery chalk skeletons. If a husk is an outer shell, our bones will be husks for air and children passing. We'll look upon the sweet cane sugar yellow of our once bodies. They'll run through fields of us, passing finger over femur like we once did to our own yellow fields of grasses. Disturbing our hollow bones, they will dig us up, dig up our worlds of wariness. We will prove once again that time is still, alive as ever, just a little more quiet now, so that when the softness of their fingers disturbs our wary ends and endings, we are unsettled, touched, disquieted. That's why you and I tremble now, seeking warmth any old where that we can find it. The second poem is called Idolatry. Idolatry. Cut the interest off the top of what my body earns. These uninsured appendages still gleaming. My copywritten Twitter bio has pull. I'm binging on their faux worship currency. These earnings are meager but mine. The squalor is earned and this hunger becomes me. I'm painting a still life of myself stagnating, printing a life on high gloss with filters and passes, forever fumbling for the next reinvention. The branding of this body is chaos magic. I am an approachable object, a carved wooden idol. If I am a deity, I am with the rank closest to dirt. A blue fire has pressed to my clay limbs, listen for the hardening and aging of me. Somebody overspiced and overpriced the pot, once sharp, now it is battered to bitterness. A little more acerbic if I allowed it. I have been sick for a while now. I gulp air to dilute the poison. Never mind that it is the poison. Never mind that I drink the poison. I am transplendent, glittering. It glows from my chest. I am three-hearted. I am clamorous, chaotic, altered on phones. These meager earnings are mine. Maybe I haven't been sick for a while now. I'm a vessel and my holdings disarm me. Drink from me. Let's both pretend we're somewhere else. Here's you and me in a race car. Here's you and me on tandem theory. Here's looking at you, child. We'll pretend to be nonchalant. What about sun gazing, or what I call looking at you, kid? What about the sensation of being good, the overdosing on being good? And I'll pretend to want the truth. I'm always afraid that I'm being watched. Yo, of course I'm being watched. Those disembodied eyes are unbearable. I will start an auto call to naivety. Everyone gets one last chalice. I will perform this until it feels real. Repeat the movement, sidewalks, bus stops, stages. My brain is split and I am stretching. My spirit is repelled when we are touching. Let's have all our conversations under this white sheet with the light coming through. I am not tight, my body dislikes you. Don't come around here no more. I'm checked all the way the hell out, moored on this mattress. If they ask why I did it, tell them it was for the sun. Beyond the sun, I have needed nothing. I'll eat nothing else, sun gazing. Will I become her me? I will stand in her rays. No more milk, honey, dates. I won't consume anything at all. This thinnest layer is not translucent. I can only drink water, only drink air, only gasp for air, only pant for air on the shore. On the shore, gills trembling, on the shore where I'm slowing, bowing, deflating on the sharp rocks there, giving all my effects over stillness. The last poem is called The Intimacy of Absence. The intimacy of absence. In a shared accident, you can be impaled by the broken body of those with whom you are breaking your final breath. Those of us who are unafraid of the stoic promise of collision will make like the birds do instead. Live our lives in patterns, murmurations, swallow one another up in the caress of a million other bodies, racing to close the gap, then collapsing away. In the final stretch, you and I, rowed by tides, never colliding. You and I have the best secret of all. We are not any better when we love. We can do it all from far away. We can love each other in avoidance. We're like the memory of pulling away. Pulling away will be a pull on me, because I'll remember you fondly for that. I'll give you nothing that you can hold. Let's stay friends in URL and never let on what we know. Years after all we've almost seen when we cross one another. melting into the wallpaper of 2 hot ballrooms and dies as prize for having dodged yours, blessings condensate on mine. To tear me away from the thrill of your silence, solar plexus filled to bursting, pregnant pauses heavy with promise, sliding in any corner that'll welcome me, nestled between 2 hard walls. It is firm and will do to mimic your presence. We might miss ourselves again, off track after all these races. Where do we run without one another? Lost without my mechanical hair. I might search your face in crowds and wonder at your absence. Idle thoughts passing over you unseen. I might miss you here one day again, but not if I see you first. But not if I see you first.